Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be filming my well, it's not April. Okay, let's try that again. Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be filming my March wrap-up. March ended up being quite the roller coaster of a reading month, so I have some 5 stars, have some 2 and 1 star reads, nothing really in the middle, mostly just 4, 5, or 1 and 2, so kind of, like I said, all over the place. And let's just get into discussing each one of them. So the first book I read this month was not on any lists. There was no reason I needed to read this beyond the fact that I've just been dying to. So it kind of put me a little behind on goals and stuff, but I don't care because I absolutely loved it. And that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is a story following 2 timelines. One is focused in the early 1700s where we have Addie LaRue, our main character, who ends up making a deal with this demon type figure to live forever. However, she quickly realizes that the catch is that no one will ever remember her. As soon as they or she leaves the room or they fall asleep or anything like that, they forget about her and she ends up living for centuries dealing with this sort of a not really life, I guess. The other timeline is essentially modern day. It's set in 2014 and she ends up meeting a man who remembers her, and it goes on from there. This is a very character-driven story, which is part of why I feel like it's so different from Victoria Schwab's other works. I've read the Darker Shade of Magic series, really didn't love it. I liked the first book actually, but the second and third ended up disappointing me quite a bit. And then I also read This Savage Song by V.E. Schwab, and that one I ended up enjoying, but I never felt much of a drive to pick up the sequel. So definitely I found that Victoria Schwab was not for me, which is why this wasn't really on my radar very strongly, because I just didn't trust her, because just for my personal reading tastes. However, I've heard people mention that this is actually very different from her other works. I know she herself was actually concerned about this reaching the right audience because it's so different from her usual stuff, and she feels like her usual audience might not enjoy this quite as much as her other things, and then those who would enjoy it have read her other things and don't enjoy those, so they're not as willing to pick this up, that kind of an issue. I do feel like it's starting to spread more into a community that will enjoy it, and that population of people who would enjoy this definitely includes myself. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Really beautiful story, wonderful writing, a wonderful exploration not only of Addie LaRue as a character, but also the themes of being remembered and what that means to people, relationships and connection to the world, and how art and other things like that can allow you to make your mark on the world. It's not necessarily a book about art, so it's not like a super artsy type story, but it is about how art enables you to make an impact. And I really enjoyed those themes. There were a lot of themes of history and living through history and what that's like, coming to understand what really makes life worth living, and a lot of that has to do with the connections we're able to make and the relationships we're able to have. So it's a beautiful story, definitely a new favorite of the year, and also probably of all time. It's one of my new favorites. I really enjoyed it, highly recommend it. If you have been wary of V.E. Schwab in the past, if you've experienced her other stories and found that they weren't quite for you, definitely give this one a try. You might find it more enjoyable, although again, I will say it is very character driven. So if you struggle with that, be aware of that going into this book, because it can feel very slow and kind of repetitive if you're focused on it from a plot perspective, but if you're focused on it from a character perspective, then it doesn't have that same repetitive feeling. Just a warning on that, but beyond that, I really enjoyed it, and I'm so glad I finally got to it, even though it kind of put me behind on like my Bookopoly TBR and stuff. It was totally worth it. Next in the month, I ended up completing an audiobook I started back in February, and unfortunately I ended up giving this book 2.5 stars, so definitely kind of a dud for the month, but that was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This book, while it's not awful, I mean, I gave it 2.5 stars as opposed to, you know, even 2 or 1, but it's just very boring, to be frank. The majority of the book, it started off pretty good and it held my attention, and there were periods throughout the story that it caught my attention again. It was really fun because there was a lot of like piratey feeling to it. Like this one definitely gave me Pirates of the Caribbean vibes, as far as, I mean, they're not pirates, but you know, you have your ocean adventures and this great mythological beast essentially that you're hunting, and there's a lot of myths and legends and stories that they tell each other. So that's really fun. That's a really fun aspect of it. But a lot of it is taken up by describing whales and whaling and why whaling's the best thing in the world and why whalers should be more respected and why whales are the coolest animals in the world. And it was interesting, but it just got very long-winded. And when I'm going into a book looking for a fictional story, an actual story, I don't need a bunch of stuff that feels like I'm reading a nonfiction work, if that makes sense. So that was just something that really threw me off. Now, I say that having read Les Mis all the way through and really enjoyed it, but a lot of that also is taken up by kind of like a nonfiction feel. But percentage-wise, there's a lot more story in Les Mis compared to the like discussions of history and philosophy, whereas in this it felt like, I could be wrong if you like actually did the math, but it felt like there was a lot more focus on the history and philosophy than there was on the actual story. And that may be in part because they're on the ocean, so only so much can happen. And even when it came back to the story, there was a lot of repetitive, like they came across another ship and they asked the ship about if they had seen Moby Dick, and the ship captain will tell them a story, and it just happened over and over again. And I just got very bored. But there were parts I laughed out loud in. Herman Melville definitely has some fun lines and fun scenes throughout this. And I will say the first like chunk of the book right before Ishmael actually gets on the ship with Captain Ahab is very interesting and enjoyable. I actually really liked the beginning, and I was honestly surprised that I enjoyed it so much. I thought that I was going to end up enjoying this book a lot more than I actually ended up doing, because once they got on the ship, that was when a lot of the philosophizing and discussions of history and whaling and stuff ended up coming in, discussions of science and all that jazz. So it just ended up really losing me at that point. And so it was one that I'm glad I read. And there were enjoyable things about it, and I think the right personality will enjoy this. It definitely doesn't surprise me that a lot of people do enjoy it, but it also doesn't surprise me that a lot of people really don't like it. So it's definitely a niche story in my opinion. Certain people are really gonna enjoy it, but definitely not a book for everyone. Up next, I had a 1-star read that's technically a DNF, and that is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, this was a reread for me, so I don't feel too bad about giving it 1 star on Goodreads, like actually giving it a rating on Goodreads, because I do know how it ends, I do know the story, so I feel like I can. But this was one I reread for the sake of trying to see if I could join the fan club, because I read this in high school, hated it. And I actually didn't, though I read it in high school, I didn't read it for a class. I read it on my own. I wanted to mention that because I know a lot of people feel like if you read a book for school, then you tend to not like it as much, which is not honestly really my experience. So in fact, I have very fond memories of reading a bunch of books that I read for school. So I'm kind of the outlier there, and this I read on my own and did not like it. And so I wanted to give it another chance now that I'm a little older, see if I'd enjoy it, and got halfway through and just could not do it. I just don't like the characters or the plot. That's mostly what it is. In that vlog, I also mentioned that I do like the writing style, so I'd be willing to give F. Scott Fitzgerald another try on a different story, but this one just does not work for me. I will link my vlog down below if you want to see more in-depth thoughts on this, but yeah, it just ended up not working out, and I'm definitely going to finally get rid of this copy that I've held on to forever, just waiting to see if maybe I would like it more in the future, and I don't, and that's okay. That's okay. It's nice to have a book I can talk about when I need to discuss my least favorite books of all time, because I have very few books I completely hate. So, you know, there's, I guess, a bright side to this. I don't know. Then after those duds, I was really hoping to pick up a book that I would just adore, and I did, and that was Room by Emma Donoghue, which I gave 5 out of 5 stars. This was so good. This follows the story of a young boy who's 5 years old, and he he has literally grown up just in this room. His mother was abducted from college and has been kept for the past several years in this room. I think it's been about 7 years. And he was born there, and so he's grown up in this room. That's his whole world. He doesn't know anything else. And in this, they end up concocting a plan to escape, and things go on from there. It's a really hard novel to read, as you can imagine, based on that synopsis, but I felt like it was very well done. Especially, I'm actually taking a child development class right now for school, and a lot of the things we're learning about child development and cognitive development and stuff really plays a role in this. So I was very impressed by Emma Donoghue's ability to recognize some of these different developmental issues that might be going on, as well as just like normal development for kids, like kids at the age of 5, how they see the world, how they're able to interact with it, how they lack the ability to really think abstractly and don't necessarily understand everything that adults understand yet. And it was just very, very well done to have an adult novel written from the perspective of a child. I felt like she did a very good job. I know a lot of people struggle with stories from the perspective of a child, so definitely know that going into this is completely from the perspective of the 5-year-old boy, and that can be kind of hard sometimes. But for me, again, with that background in psychology that I have, and just being able to real-time learn about these developmental stages and then see it act out in here was really fascinating to me personally. And yeah, the writing was just really good. I really felt for the characters. I loved the ending. I love when they have an ending that feels like it closes a chapter in the person's lives while also leaving it open for life continues after for these characters, that they still have a lot of room to grow. They still have a lot of experiences to have, things to learn. And that's okay, that's just life. Like, you're never completely done until you're done. So yeah, I really, really adored this. This was actually one of the books on my Bookopoly TBR, so finally, halfway through the month, ended up getting around to that list. Not going to lie, I don't think I'm going to finish my full Bookopoly TBR for March and April, but I'm gonna do my best. Anyway, so yes, read that. Really enjoyed it. 5 out of 5 stars. Definitely a favorite of the year. And then we had yet another fabulous read, yet another almost 5 stars. I think I ended up giving it like 4.75, 4.5, so very close. Just not quite to that point for me personally, but definitely a very, very strong contender. Probably has a possibility of being on my favorites of the year list still. Anyway, that book is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Finally got around to this. I wanted to read it in February for Black History Month and did not, so it was very nice to pick it up this month and absolutely adored it. This is an epistolary novel following Celie and her sister, and Celie basically writes letters to God, and that's what this whole book is made up of. And then her sister ends up leaving, so she writes letters to Celie. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story just about the Black experience in America. I want to say this is early 20th century is where this is set. And it was very difficult to read. There's a lot of hard-hitting things. I mean, it starts off with her father, Celie's father, raping her as a child, and so automatically it's just very hard-hitting. It's a very heavy story. I honestly don't know how to share my full feelings about this book because it really did have an impact on me where it really caused me to, I don't want to say question my beliefs because I'm still like firm in my personal belief system and everything, but I guess it caused me to expand on my understanding of my own beliefs and expand on my own view of the world, and in a way that really was powerful to me. So I feel like a lot of those specific feelings are very personal, which is why I'm not going to share them here, but I will say the writing's wonderful in this. Celie as a character is so fascinating. Her growth throughout the story is beautiful, just from going from someone who feels like she can't speak up to someone who really takes her own life in her own hands. and just lives to the best of her ability within the society she's in. The only reason this isn't a 5-star is totally like a personal thing, just in the fact that there was a little bit of sexual content and language that made me slightly uncomfortable, which, I mean, I'm okay with being uncomfortable in stories. There are certain, how do I put this? Because I gave Room 5 stars, and there was a lot of uncomfortable things in that for sure. But it's just the approach, I guess, and like the context that kind of changes my feelings towards it. I don't know. Basically, there's nothing necessarily wrong objectively with this story. It's just more my personal preference, and so it made it a little bit hard to read at points, a little bit uncomfortable for me to read, and not in a way where I felt like I was growing from that discomfort. There were parts in this that were uncomfortable that I felt like I grew from the discomfort, so I thought that was very valid and important and really made it almost a 5 stars for me, whereas there were a few times where there was discomfort that I felt like was unnecessary, but this is still probably going to be on my favorites of the year. Absolutely adore it, and definitely one I will revisit in the future and continue to think about for sure. And the last book I completed this month was actually a buddy read. I buddy read this with Naomi from Naomi's bookshelf, and that was Villette by Charlotte Brontë. I worked on this throughout the month with Naomi and ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. So I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, Naomi did not enjoy it very much. I think she ended up giving it 1 star. So definitely she was not pleased with it. But personally, I enjoyed it. In this, we follow Lucy Snow, who is our unreliable narrator, and we follow her from her childhood, some experiences there with her godmother and her godmother's family, and then we end up seeing her grow up to become a teacher in this small town in Brussels called Villette. It's a very interesting story because Lucy Snow is extremely unlikable. She's a very flawed character. She's, like I said, very unreliable, and she ends up coming into contact and developing relationships with other very unlikable people. I don't want to spoil exactly who because I feel like there might be spoilers in saying specifically who, but there's a lot of unlikable people in here that makes it so hard to completely enjoy the story, but I still found it engaging. I actually found Lucy Snow to be a very interesting character and found her love interest to be a very interesting character as well, despite the fact that they are both very flawed. I felt like I liked seeing their change in dynamics throughout the novel. I really enjoyed Charlotte Bronte's writing style in this. I think it showed a lot of growth from Jane Eyre. I mean, I love Jane Eyre better than this, I will say that, but the writing in it, you can definitely tell she matured a lot in writing this when compared to her writing style in Jane Eyre. But I think one of my biggest complaints about this book is that it was very slow, and it kind of felt like a drawn-out Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. So Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë is about Agnes who ends up becoming a governess. And I love that story. That's my favorite Brontë novel, and even though it's very quiet and the love story is very without drama, so to speak, there's very mild drama throughout that story, and it's very much a life sketch. But I think what draws me to it is it's that story that I love, but it keeps it short. It's a very short novel compared to many of the other Brontë novels, and I think the size of it works for that kind of story. I feel like if it had been longer, it would have felt very drawn out, and I probably wouldn't have liked it as much. Whereas this one, I feel like tells a similar story in many ways. I mean, there's a little bit more drama, a little bit more like gothic aspects to the story, but really it's telling a very similar story of experiences as a teacher and experiences leaving home, and a lot of those same sort of themes are in this book as are in Agnes Grey, but this book is 2 to 3 times longer than Agnes Grey, which ends up making it feel very drawn out, very repetitive. I felt like it's just longer than it needed to be for this kind of a story, and I felt like a lot of things could have been cut out. I also felt like there was a bit of a meandering style to the plot. It kind of felt like it went all over the place. Like, you got to this point where you're like, okay, this is the plot, this is the story it's telling, but then it would switch gears really fast. There was like 2 or 3 times that it did that, and it felt just very odd. It just didn't feel as cohesive as I feel like it would have if she had focused in a little bit more and had more of a overall plot rather than a bunch of little subplots that kind of came together into this story, if that makes sense. So yeah, that made it a little bit tricky. And the ending, I still don't know completely how I feel about it. I feel like I enjoyed the ending, but also it was a bit of a painful ending. I will warn people about that. But it also, I felt like, added a new layer to the story that when I revisit this book, which I will in the future, I'm planning to keep my copy and revisit in the future, I think I'll enjoy it more because of that added layer that the ending gave to it. However, this read through, there were points where I felt like it was dragging a bit and it was hard to get through. But on the whole, I'd say I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so definitely really good. Not as good as Jane Eyre. I think Jane Eyre is still my favorite of Charlotte Bronte's novels, and I think it's going to stay that way because the only one I have left is The Professor, and I don't have super high expectations for that one. So anyway, it was good, enjoyable. Sad Naomi really did not like it, but it was still enjoyable to buddy read it with her and hear her thoughts as we went along, even though they were completely opposite of mine. In some ways that kind of made it more interesting because I felt like we were able to kind of see both sides of whether we liked it or disliked it, kind of a thing. So anyway, definitely worth the read, but especially if you love the Brontes, but not Charlotte's best work in my opinion, and really not the best of the Bronte novels. I will say though, moving into things I'm currently reading, it was really nice to read this alongside The Brontes by Juliet Barker, which I'm still buddy reading with Emily from Novelle Novels, and will be through April. I'm hoping to finish this by the end of April, but we may end up going into May a little bit. But anyway, not gonna spend too much time on this because I've been reading it for a couple months now, but I'm still really enjoying it, and it was fun to read Villette beside it because Charlotte Bronte herself actually has some similar flaws to Lucy Snow in Villette based on my reading of this. She just very much has a similar kind of melodramatic nature, kind of a judgmental nature, and Charlotte definitely, through her letters and stuff, you're able to see that side of her a little bit as well. I think Lucy Snow is much more extreme and therefore much more dislikable, but Charlotte was kind of like that. I almost feel like Charlotte is kind of a mix of Jane Eyre and Lucy Snow, kind of just combined into one person, which is interesting to think about how Charlotte explored 2 sides of her personality through those 2 books. But yeah, this is going great. Still obsessed with Anne. Anne just will always be my favorite Bronte sister. Her books and just her as a person, she's just amazing. She has just such quiet strength that I really look up to. She's not perfect, she's definitely flawed, but she just has so much strength that I really appreciate. So anyway, this is going well still. And then really quick, the other 2 books I'm working on currently are Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I'm listening to this on audiobook, a little under halfway through, so making my way through. Unfortunately, I did not finish this in the 2 months I was supposed to for the BookTube Spin, which this was my, I guess, chosen one for the BookTube Spin, hosted by Rick MacDonnell, and he'll probably be posting his next one towards the end of this month, beginning of May probably. Anyway, but I will still finish this by the end of this month, kind of finish it off, so that will be good. And so far, I'm enjoying it. It's definitely a YA fantasy, so, you know, has a lot of those tropes, but it's enjoyable. I'm intrigued. Don't know if I'll ever read the second one at this point, but maybe if by the end of this I'm really intrigued, I will pick up the sequel, Muse of Nightmares. But yeah, for now, it's enjoyable. I'm liking it. And then the other one I'm physically reading is Blood and Beauty by Sarah Dunant. No dust jacket on this because I don't like reading with the dust jacket if I can avoid it. But anyway, I'm really enjoying this so far. This is a story following the Borgia family, and it's been really good. I'm about a quarter of the way through, so not super far, but it's good. Very dramatic and a lot of politics going on. And yeah, it's intriguing. This is the second book I'll be working on for my Books to Books TBR. I'm hoping to get to at least 2 more before the end of April if I can, so I can at least have a majority of the books in my Books to Books TBR read. But we'll see how that goes. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, your thoughts on them, also what you read in March and what you've been loving reading recently, as I would love to know, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!